our last week of our current sermon series on the events leading up to Jesus' triumphal entry. That's what we'll be celebrating next week, is the triumphal entry of Jesus, which we know as Palm Sunday. Well, it's been a good run. It's been fascinating to see both the similarities and differences between Matthew and Mark's Gospels, and they both share these three events that occur right before Jesus enters into Jerusalem. And Jesus predicts his suffering and death for the third and final time. We saw that in the first week. Then we see this unbelievable request that's asked of the mother of the sons of Zebedee, or at least, in the least, from James and John. And today we'll be looking at an undeserved grace. An undeserved grace. I entitled this message, Undeserved Grace, because there's a tinge of irony. It's a tongue-in-cheek sort of thing, if you will. No one deserves grace in the first place. You know that, right? None of us deserve grace in the first place. According to Christianity, the definition of grace is the free and unmerited favor of God as manifested in the salvation of sinners and the endowment of blessings. But the interesting fact is that according to the scripture text that we'll look at today, salvation serves a different purpose. It's not the eternal salvation or the positional aspect, but more so salvation through liberation, relieving the broken, the downtrodden, those who are suffering and want to be rescued and restored. This goes along with what the prophet Isaiah says in chapter 35, verses 3 through 5. He says this, "Strengthen the feeble hands, steady the knees that give way, say to those with fearful hearts, be strong, do not fear. Your God will come. He will come with vengeance, with divine retribution. He will come to save you." And then he says this, "Then will the eyes of the blind be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped." While John the Baptist was in prison, he was confused and maybe even a little disappointed. He's probably thinking to himself, this can't be. This can't be. It's as if he genuinely wanted to know, and he wanted to hear it from Jesus himself. So he sends his disciples to question Jesus, which is recorded in Matthew 11, 3 through 6. It says this, John wants to know, "Are you the one who is to come, or should we expect someone else?" John the Baptist now, the cousin of Jesus, is asking him, "Are you the one who is to come, or should we expect someone else?" Jesus replied, "Go back and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight. The lame walk. Those who have leprosy are cleansed. The deaf hear. The dead are raised. And the good news is proclaimed to the poor. Blessed is anyone who does not stumble on account of me." Wow, you know what that sounds like to me? Undeserved grace. Undeserved grace. We're met with another scenario that goes against the grain of society. It goes against human logic, the decency of humanity, the set standard that said, hey, listen, if you are good, you are favored and blessed by God. If you're a good person, you're blessed and you're favored. Something's going your way, people. If you have struggles or suffering, inherently, you brought that upon yourself. This was the idea of the day. Generational sin was strongly believed to be the very reason why people succumb to illness and sickness and disease. In John 9, 1 through 3, it says, "As he went along, he saw a blind man from birth. His disciples asked him, 'Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?' And Jesus says this, 'Neither this man nor his parents sinned, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him.'" Wow. See, the disciples and everyone else, for that matter, in this moment had this misconception that suffering and bondage came from a lack of faith or the plague of sin. But what Jesus says here in John, it's just simply not the case. It's not true. By definition, when is grace ever deserved? Put it simply, grace is getting the very thing we don't deserve. So Jesus has just ended with telling the disciples that it's not about status, fame, popularity, titles even. No, it's more about servanthood. It's about serving the least of these. They've just had a pretty amped discussion on who's worthy or deserving to sit at Jesus' left or right in glory. And just a refresher, Jesus told his disciples in Mark 10:43 through 45, "Not so with you," he says. "Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many." But let me ask, by what standards do we assess greatness? Whose standards do we assess greatness? By the religious institution? By the church? By the government? By the majority? By the status quo? By cultural relativism where there are no absolutes? Well, except for that one, right? Because if you're saying there's no absolutes, then there's actually one absolute, that there's no absolutes. In the scripture that we'll look at today, these men are not just undeserving, but they were looked at as a nuisance to society. As the very reason why society and culture had declined. There was no room for the poor and the oppressed. Jesus had more worthy people to give his time and attention and miracles to. The needy should have just been left in that state because surely they could not contribute to society. So they were deemed as outcasts, people plagued by misfortune and unwanted loss. Someone had to play that role, right? In a shattered and desperate world where there will always be the needy. But when Jesus steps on the scene, everything changes. What everyone thinks is valuable, Jesus is calling worthless. What everyone holds as important is actually irrelevant. The looks Jesus probably would have received, the stares, the incredulous sighs, the wide-eyed amazement that probably would have come off rude and disrespectful. I mean, Jesus turns the world upside down by his undeserved grace that he provides. So with that being said, please turn with me in your Bibles to Matthew 20, verse 29. Matthew 20, verse 29. Will I get his attention is the question for this first point. Matthew 20, 29, and we're going to look at verses 29 and 31. Will I get Jesus' attention? As Jesus and his disciples were leaving Jericho, a large crowd followed him. 2 blind men were sitting by the roadside, and when they heard that Jesus was going by, they shouted, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on us." And the crowd rebuked them and told them to be quiet. But they shouted all the louder, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on us." So fresh off the conversation of servanthood and giving his life up for a ransom, as a ransom for many, we find a beautiful interruption in Jesus's and the disciples' travel plans. Upon leaving Jericho, Matthew says that a large crowd followed Jesus, and he wants to make sure that we understand the context. Have you ever been in a large crowd of people and tried to get someone's attention? Yeah, it's not easy. Unless, of course, you're holding their hand or you're within earshot of them. Other than that, it's pretty impossible to get someone's attention. And on this day, the two blind men were sitting by the roadside begging. These men would have been deemed as the poor and unfortunate ones, those who couldn't catch a break, but for some reason it would seem that they did not have anyone else to blame but themselves. And judging by the crowd's rebuke of the men, this seemed to be their normal spot, their routine spot for begging. It's almost as if we could wonder why a local of Jericho wouldn't have taken Jesus and his disciples on a different route for fear of embarrassment, or at least to keep Jericho's dignity. But let's put this in another perspective. The two blind men. This is a prime opportunity. I mean, who knows how long these men have suffered from blindness? It was long enough to want healing and help. I mean, think about it. When they hear that Jesus is literally a few feet away, that he's walking by them, who wouldn't try and get his attention? Who wouldn't? Even with the crowd around him, they would do all they could to try and get Jesus' attention. Right? From the stories they would have heard, from people passing by, from the commotion that was made, that this Jesus heals and works wonders and miracles. And finally, for these two men, it's as if they're on level ground. They have a chance, an opportunity to be changed by Jesus. So they do the best thing that they know they can at the time. They shout to try and get Jesus' attention. Lord, Son of David, have mercy on us. That's what they shout. This is an entirely different favor that was just asked by the mother of the sons of Zebedee. This could be their one and only shot, this last-ditch effort to try and find some sort of healing and restoration from none other than Jesus himself. And notice how everyone else around them reacts. Right? It says that they rebuked them and told them to be quiet. Really? Yeah. I'm sorry, but that was the culture in the world of the day. Jesus doesn't have time for people like you. Shh! Quiet! Don't bother Jesus right now. He's got more important places to be and more important people to see. Where do you come off thinking that you're worthy to gain Jesus' attention? You don't deserve his presence, and you don't deserve his power. But I love this. I love this. It says that they shout all the more louder. They didn't care. It's Jesus. They didn't fall in line. Lord, Son of David, have mercy on us. But the one question that I've got to be wondering in this entire time as they even begin to shout towards Jesus' direction is, will I get Jesus' attention? Let's not forget that they're going by sound, they're going by reverberation, they're going by instinct. No sight, just hope. Not being able to know if the urgency is well received or not. Just waiting and wondering and crying out to Jesus. I mean, can you relate to this? in your own life? Those times where you wonder if you've got God's attention? Does He hear? Does He hear my prayers? I mean, does He see? Does He see me? Does He know how incredibly difficult my life is right now? If only God would answer. Now, turn to Mark 10, 46 through 48. Mark 10, 46 through 48. Mark 10, 46 through 48. Then they came to Jericho as Jesus and his disciples, together with a large crowd, were leaving the city. A blind man, Bartimaeus, which means son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside begging. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." Many rebuked him and told him to be quiet, but he shouted all the more, "Son of David, have mercy on me." You know, I find it fascinating that for Matthew it was two men who were not named, but for Mark it is one man who is not just named, but known as the son of Timaeus. So, just a moment ago, Matthew says it's the mother of the sons of Zebedee, while Mark says it's James and John, right? We had Matthew giving a little more detail, but now he's being a little bit more vague. According to Mark, the blind beggar of Jericho's name is Bartimaeus. Mark makes it more personal. It's as if this is a testimonial. To know the beggar's name makes it a little bit more intimate, as if we can all somehow relate to Bartimaeus in this story. But there's still one fact that we haven't discussed that Matthew and Mark both include. This cry that comes from Bartimaeus would actually come across pretty offensive to the Jews. It would. You see, for Bartimaeus to shout in the public square or gain attention was off limits already because of the present state that he was in. You see, he was unclean. But even more than that, when he shouts, "Son of David," well, to the Jews, them is fighting words. As you know, to call Jesus by this title to the Jews, they would all know Bartimaeus is singling Jesus out as the Messiah. Mainly in Matthew's gospel, this title is used to prove to the Jews that Jesus was, is, and always will be the Messiah. And Mark uses it as well to link the Son of Man to the Son of God here, the Son of David, which in turn, they are both making the same exact assertion that this Jesus that everyone else sees before them, remember, this Jesus that everybody has full view of right now and can see him, that this blind man is crying out to, he is truly the Messiah. Now think about this for 1 second. I know it's early in the morning. But isn't it interesting that it took a blind man to see and believe that every other seeing person didn't see and believe? All right, turn to Matthew 20, 32 and 33. Question and called. Question and called. Matthew 20, 32 and 33. Jesus stopped and called them. "What do you want me to do for you?" he asked. "Lord," they answered, "we want our sight." We want our sight. So it's Jesus who asks the question now. And of course, to us, this seems like a no-brainer, right? When Jesus comes up to them and initiates conversation, his first question is, "What do you want me to do for you?" Really? It's definitely not a rhetorical question. Jesus wants to truly know what these blind men want him to do. And notice, this scenario is way different from the mother of the sons of Zebedee who approaches Jesus to ask a favor. And the reaction may seem the same, but I'd like to think that Jesus has more compassion upon these men than on the mother of the sons of Zebedee. It was as if he was more open and vulnerable to what favor they would ask of him. And can anyone guess what they asked for? Drum roll, please. Their sight. In fact, they say, we want our sight. Again, in this moment, they could have asked for anything from Jesus. Anything. It seems as if he was prepared to answer right on the spot, and yet they simply want their sight. They want to see, maybe for the very first time. Seeing would mean they wouldn't have to beg anymore. They could live their lives the way they want to. They could be reunited with their family and with their friends. They wouldn't be seen as outcasts anymore or unclean. They'd be able to work and find purpose and fulfillment. Sight would open the floodgates to endless possibilities for them. And so they simply say to Jesus, we want our sight. All right, turn to Mark 10, 49 through 50. Mark 10, 49 through 50. 49 and 50, I should say. Jesus stopped and said, call him. So they called to the blind man, cheer up, on your feet, he's calling you. Throwing his cloak aside, he jumped to his feet and came to Jesus. I don't know about you, but this testimony that he gives of Bartimaeus just gives me the chills. Woo! And I love the intricate details that Mark gives in his gospel. It says that Jesus stopped. Jesus stopped. Jesus always kept moving. If you read the Gospels, Jesus always kept moving. He was always on mission. He'd move from town to city to town, no rest for the weary. He's walking or he's by boat, making his way through all the surrounding places. Yes, there were moments where he would stop, but even when he healed the woman with the issue of blood, he was moving. But here, Jesus deliberately stops. Bartimaeus has caught his attention, even to the point that Jesus tells his disciples to call him. Did you notice that? It says, call him. Call him. I mean, can you imagine how personal this would be, to be known as the local beggar of Jericho, the blind beggar of Jericho, and to be picked out of the crowd, to have Jesus stop and call you? This would be epic. Bartimaeus was called by Jesus. So in the midst of the rebuke of the crowd, there's this faint calling that Bartimaeus receives. And I'm sure, I'm sure of it. Once Jesus stops everything, once Jesus stops in place, everyone is gripped by the silence. I can imagine that no one says a word at this point because they're all waiting to see what Jesus does next. What's he going to do? What's he going to say? I mean, the crowd is certainly manipulated by this moment. Bartimaeus is shouting, the crowd is shouting, all the while Jesus is calling. Jesus is calling. And just by sheer instinct, utter fascination, Bartimaeus is waiting to receive good news, which finally arrives. His disciples say, cheer up! On your feet, he's calling you. Now, here's a really cool part about that. Many scholars believe, and I would agree, that when they say this to him, it's referring back to Isaiah 35, 3 and 5, which we read earlier. Let me read that to you again. Be strong. Do not fear. God, your God will come. He will come with vengeance, with divine retribution. He will come to save you. And then he says, then will the eyes of the blind be opened. I mean, that's all Bartimaeus needed. I mean, that's all he needed to hear. I don't think there was any hesitation at all. Like a child at Christmas who throws off the covers and runs downstairs, Bartimaeus casts off his cloak and jumps to his feet and comes running to Jesus. How awesome is that? He leaps up and he runs to Jesus. Just as much as it was a no-brainer about the question Jesus asked, for Bartimaeus, it was an obvious reaction. Hey, listen, when Jesus calls you, you come to him. You come to him. Let me ask you, what kind of questions has God been asking you lately? And has he called you? Are you waiting? Are you listening? All right, lastly, turn back to Matthew 20, verse 34. Immediate undeserved grace. Immediate undeserved grace. Matthew 20, verse 34. Jesus had compassion on them and touched their eyes. Immediately, I love that word, they received their sight and followed him. That's good. We can't judge from the tone of Jesus' voice when James and John and their mother asked Jesus the favor, but we don't know if Jesus showed an expression of surprise, right? We talked about that a little bit. Or gasped in astonishment, like, oh, how could you, right? Or if he chuckled maybe a little bit from the unbelievable request that they had just asked him. But here in this situation of the blind men asking for their sight to be restored, we know exactly how Jesus is thinking and feeling. It says Jesus had compassion on them. And not only that, it says he touched their eyes. He touched their eyes. And if you know anything about clean and unclean, these blind men were restricted to involve themselves in any public display of touching or affection. Listen, if you touched someone while you were unclean, you in turn made that person unclean. The obligation at this point was to show themselves to the priest so that they could be assessed and find out what the rituals and ceremonial law would have been to be followed and what they had to do to become clean again. And in the least, they'd have to be isolated for a time. But Jesus, he approaches them and then he touches their eyes. He goes straight to the source of their uncleanness. He touches the very organs that have deemed them as outcasts, as useless, as good-for-nothings. I mean, think about it. All this time, these people have been begging and begging and begging, waiting and wondering if their sight would at some point ever be restored. Was there ever going to be a chance to find relief? Would anyone ever show them mercy? And look at this now. Look at this. Remember, when they called Jesus, they asked for what? They asked for mercy. But Jesus does them one better. He gives them undeserved grace. And not only that, it's immediate undeserved grace. I mean, how awesome would it be to witness this? And what's the outcome? Do they go back to their families? Do they try and reconnect with friends? Do they begin looking for a steady living? No, we're told that they follow Jesus. They follow Jesus. Which, if you ask me, it only proves their genuine faith that Jesus was who they said he was. You see, for them to give lip service to Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on us, and be healed, and then leave him without any trace of allegiance, well, then that would be a little skeptical. We'd wonder if they were just in it for the healing. But it says that as they immediately were healed, they followed him. They not only knew Jesus to be the Messiah, now they have been witnesses themselves. They have experienced his power and presence in such an amazing way that the least they can do is devote the rest of their lives to following him. Lastly, look at Mark 10, 51 through 52. Mark 10, 51 through 52. "What do you want me to do for you?" Jesus asked him. The blind man said, "Rabbi, I want to see." "Go," said Jesus. "Your faith has healed you." Immediately he received his sight and followed Jesus along the road. Mark gives one distinct and interesting detail that Matthew does not. After Bartimaeus answers Jesus' question, Jesus says, "Go, your faith has healed you." In other words, Bartimaeus' faith in Jesus, now remember, not necessarily faith as in salvation, because that hasn't happened yet, but rather being liberated from his current state of being unable to see. Okay? Bartimaeus undoubtedly took to heart the prophecies that mentioned the coming Messiah would not just save the world through him, but heal every kind of sickness and disease. Isaiah 53, 4 and 5. I mean, this is wild. Jesus says, "Go, your faith has healed you." I wonder what Jesus meant by go. Of course, we see the same outcome that Matthew gave in his gospel. It says, immediately Bartimaeus received his sight and followed Jesus along the road. Now, this gives a little bit more description that he went the same way of Jesus. This doesn't necessarily mean that Bartimaeus followed Jesus from here on out. This passage that Mark gives as it concludes, it hints at more of an open ending. I mean, we can't truly tell whether Bartimaeus followed Jesus or not, but I'll tell you something that we do know. Bartimaeus didn't shy away from telling what Jesus did for him to other people. And that may have been the reason why Jesus said, "Go." This immediate undeserved grace that Bartimaeus received from Jesus would have bolstered and strengthened his faith in Jesus all the more. You know why? Because that's what grace does. It changes. It transforms. It restores and it heals. It gives purpose and it provides hope and fulfillment. So my prayer for you today is that this story encourages you to remember the grace that God has shown you in your life. Maybe you're in a funk right now. Maybe this is a season that has been so difficult for you. You're just trying to keep your head above water. For the time being, you don't really see any end in sight. I pray that this encounter that Jesus had with the blind beggars reassures you of God's undeserved grace towards you. Be reminded and blessed by what John said here in John 1:16. Listen to this. I love it. Out of Jesus' fullness, we have all received grace in place of grace already given. Amen. Would you pray with me?